guest here is Brian Russell, and he's going to give us some information on using crowdacting to maximize political freedom and autonomy. Brian is a team member at Crowdaction.org, the world's first platform for crowdacting, director of Crowdacting Barcelona, a group working on strategies for digital and material sovereignty, and a founding member of Pan Mazdu, a former leper colony that is now an environmental educational center overlooking Barcelona. For the last 16 years, the Intentional community has opened its doors most Sundays to give people a glimpse of life based on the principles of consensus, sharing, horizontality, transparency, and harmony with nature. I'm pleased to introduce Mr. Russell.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. So Collection is a group that we've started in Amsterdam to try to do what are essentially assurance contracts. And you guys are hopefully all familiar with what an assurance contract is. I was really excited to come to this event because I wanted to find out more about what the world's largest assurance contract is, how it's going. You guys, an assurance contract, as I'm sure you know, is an agreement to say, I will do X if Y people also do it with me. So in the case of Free State was to say, okay, 20,000 people are going to move to New Hampshire. If we all do it together, then we have power in a group. And what we hope to do with Collection is to set up a platform that allows that concept to be sort of extended out and to use different things to, and I'll give you some examples of some potential campaigns of crowdacting. What we call crowdacting is just an assurance contract. Another recent example in London was there was a London student strike where people said, okay, I'll go on a rent strike if a bunch of other people join me, and this way we can collectively bargain with the excessive rents. As you know, in many cities, the gentrification situation is really bad, and students couldn't pay rent anymore, and so they went on strike. I don't really know that number, 1,000 people, just guessing. But there are many other things kind of happening with the internet right now in terms of groups that are kind of trying to find new ways to organize. And this is what we're working on. So just to recap, crowdacting in a nutshell is just like saying, okay, I'll do this thing if a bunch of people do it with me. So it's a lot like crowdfunding, except instead of putting in money, we all put in a promise for action. It's similar to change.org, Avaz, and these petition platforms. Basically, the problem that I have with petition platforms is that basically it organizes people to then send a letter, which doesn't really have much impact. And this is really frustrating because it leads to collectivism or slacktivism. This concept that basically, okay, I can sign a letter and it'll send I can sign a petition and it'll send a letter to some politician or to some I don't know, some prison director or whoever, and I don't even know that they're going to read it. So it doesn't really give me political power, and this is why people like myself very often, don't even bother to resend the petitions, don't bother to sign them, and even though there may be things that the vast majority of humanity agrees with, like for example, the removal of nuclear weapons, we still don't get them done because we don't really have any political power, even when almost all of us agree. So basically, we're hoping to change this, and obviously this tool, crowdacting can be used for civic activism or civic action. That's kind of the most obvious application, but I'm going to try to kind of open your mind to some more ideas. So for example, you can use it much like just doing something that the state isn't doing. So suppose the state is not taking care of your local park, you could all go and clean it up. Another example might be that you wanted to band together with a group of people, kind of like crowdfunding, but in a way that's more active, saying, okay, I want to actually be involved as an owner or as a cooperative member. We need a new internet, basically, because the ISPs are screwing us. So it'd be great if we just actually were the controllers of our own internet, and each person controlled their own node, and that's what we actually got going in Barcelona, by the way. We've got a thing called GifiNet, which is the world's largest intranet, and people are really actually setting up our own internet, because what happened during the recent elections was that the local internet service providers like Telefonica, they shut us down when we had a referendum in Catalonia. So people are taking this seriously, and people are actually setting up their own internet and setting up ISPs, and this is an interesting use case. Another thing that you could use it for would be to mitigate risk or to assure safety, because sometimes people are attacked by the weakest link. So you could say like, okay, let's all go to a rally, but what happens if we're outnumbered by the cops? We get beat up, which really sucks. And I want to be sure that if I'm going to go to the rally, that there's enough people to go with me, that we're a critical mass, that we don't get beat up, that we actually outnumber the cops. So that would be another example. Obviously, if the rally is illegal, this creates other problems, and you're saying, okay, I'm going to sign up for an illegal action. You know, the Tea Party was done, the Boston Tea Party was done in secrecy. And actually, that's maybe not so interesting as being able to do it out in the open. But anyway, I'll get to that later. And the last thing, you know, voter coordination. This is the thing that I think may be interesting to libertarians because they're really interested in the third party, and I'll get to that later. But basically, sorry, my first PowerPoint ever. I'm sure you'll notice the amateur nature of it. But basically, what I want to, one thing that I want to say is that when we move beyond petition platforms, we actually get into action, that it requires kind of a study of, well, what does action mean? I mean, what does it mean? And I think it's interesting that here in the States, this is fairly poorly known, is that one of the best groups that have ever studied this concept have actually, the Albert Einstein Institute, have taken Gene Sharp's work, and I can give you some information about this later on, but they've just discussed strategy in a way and looked at all the different ways of nonviolent direct action that there are. And obviously when you talk about direct action, a lot of people think of, you know, property destruction and things like that, and that is part of direct action, but I think that the more interesting stuff is actually the nonviolent direct action. So basically, when we talk about our platform, what we're interested in kind of getting across is the idea that we can overcome some of the bigger problems that are facing humanity with a platform like this, if millions or billions of people were to use it. And a lot of times, these are collective action problems. Collective action problems are problems where people's individual interest leads to a conflict with their collective interest. So for example, you may live in a city where there's smog, and you're contemplating whether to buy a car, and you think, okay, I could buy a gas guzzler, or I could buy a small car. The small car is better for everyone if we all drive small cars, and it's actually safer to drive small cars if everyone's driving a small car. But if someone comes along and hits you with a big car, it's much less safe. You know, it's very dangerous. So everyone winds up buying big cars because it's safer, and everyone winds up getting a lot more smog. So these are collective action problems where, you know, in this case it may not be solvable because some people may just always want to have a big car. You know, the example of, you know, some women wearing high heels and being more endowed or more beautiful than other women who don't, you know, like how do you get over that collective action problem? That may be impossible to solve because some women just may say, well, I like to wear high heels. It's not that, you know. And so the other women who are suffering in high heels because they have to compete, you know, feel kind of like, what a bummer. But, you know, so not all collective action problems are solvable. I do want to get this across, but I think that there are some that are global that really are solvable. Another example would be overfishing. Ooh, there's something wrong with the PowerPoint. Okay, another collective action problem. So this problem, the problem of overfishing, these are problems that are, what are they called? They're called, Tragedy of the Commons, yeah. Sorry, I forget English sometimes. I haven't lived in the States since 1990. So, so another type of collective action problem that is also solvable through crowdacting is the prisoner's dilemma. You may know this problem. This is a paper written in the 1950s, and I think it's interesting that libertarians look more at this paper because there is recent sort of evidence that actually sort of debates this whole concept of that we should all compete, which is one of the sort of things that the prisoner's dilemma was arguing was, well, we need to be competitive because this is the way nature is. And in fact, what we've found in the last 20 years or so, particularly since this paper was published in 2006, was that actually mutualism is far more common than competition in nature for a good reason, and there are explainable mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation that that Darwin did not know about. And so this is kind of a, you know, I would encourage people to rethink, if you believe in competition, to rethink competition, because a lot of our new evidence around evolution shows that we don't have to compete any more than most species do. So anyway, another word for the tragedy of the commons is an open access problem. And the two traditional solutions to open access problems and prisoners' dilemmas have been government regulation and privatization. The limits of government regulation is obviously on global systems. The only way you can have government regulation is by having a global government, which I think probably no one in here wants, I hope. And it's, you know, anyway, there's lots of other problems with government regulation, which I don't need to explain to libertarians, I hope. But anyway, the other thing, and this is why I'm a little bit nervous to speak in front of this group, is because I don't know how important. I think in general in America, property rights kind of supersede all rights, and I feel a bit like talking to a group of libertarians because I don't think that property rights is the most important human right. And anyway, but basically, if you do look at privatization as a solution to tragedy of the commons problems, you always have to defend on that the owners are actually going to do good things with those resources, which has not actually been shown. If you want to look more at the tragedy of the commons and recent work, Eleanor Ostrom got a Nobel Prize. She's an economist for writing about the tragedy of the commons. I highly recommend you look into her work and why also it's really important to cooperate rather than compete around resources. But we're trying to basically encourage people to look at a third solution to these problems, a third solution to collective action problems, which is crowdacting, or what you guys have called an assurance contract. So I'm going to look at 4 examples. How am I doing on time? Where is she? Great. Okay, so I'm going to look at 4 examples of potential crowd actions that we're gonna just look at. So one of the big problems, I'm into free software, free hardware. One of the big problems I think facing our society is the Internet of Things is being populated by a bunch of stuff that's proprietary and doesn't do what we want. If your car suddenly drives you off the road and kills you and it contains proprietary software, it may not be possible to even figure out who killed you. And these are real problems that are becoming much more serious as the internet progresses and as these companies shut down more and more hardware systems that used to be open. But basically, one of the problems is that most people don't want to pay extra. You can get a Fairphone or a Libre router or things like that. There are options out there, but they're few and far between. And most people, if they're given the choice between buying a Fairphone for 400 euros and buying almost the same quality of technology for 150 euros for an Android phone, will not choose the Fairphone because there's not enough market mass behind it. So one of the ways that we could potentially overcome this problem would be to make agreements across the society to, okay, I'm gonna support free hardware, I'm gonna support free software, I'm gonna support these things, and in this way, I'll be willing to spend maybe 20% more or 30% more for an equivalent device. Even though instead of producing 20 million, they're only going to produce 1 million, we can still get a fairly good rate for it, and this would be one way. It's kind of like a Groupon. I don't know if you're familiar with Groupon, but this would be one way that we could all crowd act, we could all organize to get free hardware. Another problem that we could solve by banding together is the problem of advertising. Most of us hate advertising. I don't really know how libertarians feel about it, but basically advertising is just cognitive pollution. It's bad for society. It gives us a sense of neediness and scarcity. Plays on our insecurities. It's bad for business. We spend 2% of the GDP in the world. It's spent on ads. It's bad for the planet. It's sort of one of the 3 things upholding consumer society, along with planned obsolescence and what's the other one? Planned obsolescence. And mass production. And unfortunately, I use free software and I use an ODP file, so it's just cutting off my text, which is a bummer. That's why I really want to plug my computer in. But anyway, Windows, that's great. This is, by the way, an open and non-proprietary format, so it should be able to read it, but it can't. Anyway, one of these things. So basically, how would it work? Well, basically, it's very simple. It would just require that we actually stop buying the things that we see advertised, and it would require that to make it as agreement. Now, if I go into the subway and I see an ad for really cheap airfare, and then I've made this agreement, if I'm one of the only people that's not going to get on that plane, and everybody else is just going to continue buying that plane fare, it's going to suck. And it's going to be like when you boycott something and everybody else gets the really cheap thing and you buy the expensive, crappy one. Right? So on some level, the only way these problems actually get solved is if we make these agreements amongst a lot of us. And some collective action problems can be solved when huge numbers of people need to make the agreement, and in some cases it may require fewer. I'm going to rush a little bit here, but potentially, if you could say do it on a citywide level and say, okay, I won't buy anything I see advertised on a billboard. When my kids say, God, we got to buy that, we got to buy that, I'd write a letter to the company and say, look, I'm not going to buy this unless you stop advertising. At this point, you may be able to leverage out some advertising, and eventually that can be extrapolated out to the whole society. Other problems that we look at are, like, for example, the problem of big data. The thing with big data is that they're depending on a monopoly that's not based on the fact that they actually own the namespace or whatever. They're based on a monopoly that's based on network effect. So everybody wants to be on Facebook because everybody else is on Facebook. We could potentially, all leave, for example, WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook, and we could go to Signal Messenger, which is a community-based alternative. It's funded by donations. They have a policy of zero knowledge. This would just require basically all of us agreeing to do so. If 51% of the network all agrees to leave, then you no longer have the network effect of, say, WhatsApp being greater than that of Signal Messenger or some other alternative. Similarly, we've got a lot of problems with big data. Amazon, for example, spent $16 million in taxes in Germany in 2015 and made $11 billion. So, these companies are really kind of like laughing at laughing at governments. And they're much more powerful than governments, and we may not have any ability to get these companies out of the public sphere. And this is going to be a big problem for humanity because trust busting is not going to work. The corporations are far more powerful than the governments. World government, I hope you guys don't think is a good solution. We just are not going to necessarily even trust that the owners of these companies are going to be good people, and some people just say, well, let's go for apathy. We heard that last night. I actually think it's more important to get organized and do something about it. So, there is an alternative, believe it or not, to Amazon, for example, which is Fairmondo. A few people use it. There's a lot of sort of disadvantages still with the platform. But if we made an agreement, like if sellers made an agreement, okay, 51% of us are going to leave eBay and leave Amazon and go to Fairmondo and use it, then we have enough network effect, there will be enough products, and people would eventually be able to do the shift. So that's the idea. The basic idea behind Fairmondo and a lot of other alternatives to the current digital conglomerates are the idea that the commons, the internet is a commons and it should be owned by the people. And when we say owned by the people, it shouldn't be government owned, it should be owned by a cooperative of users. And this concept of the platform cooperativism movement, and hopefully you'll look into that. And the last thing I'm going to talk about, and this is totally, I'm not ready to throw this out to the world yet, but I'm hoping to have some conversations throughout the weekend about this, because I know you guys are very politically motivated, and this is about the potential for direct democracy that a platform like this could represent. And that is that you can actually, in the same way that crowdfunding determines which things get funded, on some level, crowdacting could determine which actions get done. And it's a way of deciding which strategies people could do on the basis that, we could do this strategy, we could do that strategy. Okay, I sign up for this one, you sign up for that one, well, we'll see who's right. Maybe some people sign up for both of them. And then this way, you can figure out which strategy as a society we could all choose to go, and we don't have to spend so much time infighting over strategy. If your strategy doesn't get enough traction, well, then you just abandon it and you take another strategy that does. So for example, this is a way of kind of like figuring out just using, it's a new concept in direct democracy that I hope people will consider. The last thing I want to say is that, of course, if you're doing anything like civil disobedience, this will need to be something that's hopefully serverless and not out in the open, so that people can't get all your data of who is the next person who's willing to go out and do whatever legal action or civil disobedience that's out there. So. I also think that crowdacting could be a tool for government oversight. In other words, the people can actually put power over the governments by telling them what to do through the threat of civil disobedience and through the threat of withdrawing their support or whatever. I mean, there's a million different options here, and I hope to discuss this more with you over the weekend. So basically, thanks for coming. I'm going to open up for questions now if there's any time left. Here's my contacts. I send out a link to this PowerPoint if you want to have more information. I've got some links also for further study about some of the things I mentioned. Just let me know do we have time?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes. If you want to come up and use the microphone, that'd be great. If you have any questions.
One of the things that alarms me is that it seems like if you have a large group like this acting, that sometimes you're in jeopardy of sort of the tyranny of the majority. where small minorities may be pushed aside by large groups acting against their interest?
Yeah, well, clearly, if there needs to be, so in a centralized server-based system, which is what we've got right now, you can just simply pick and choose and tell people, well, look, we're not gonna allow that action. This is a problem if you move this to a decentralized system. This is an issue to seriously be considered. Well, how is it that if we say, like, let's do a crowd action to go lynch somebody, how is it that you prevent that? And I think that the way that actually that can be prevented is by the fact that whatever you're doing, I mean, you can always just have a secret society and say, let's go lynch someone. And this is all going to be public. So the only security that you can basically get from something like this is the fact that the knowledge of this will all be public. Maybe not who's actually up for participating in it. That may actually be hidden using blockchain technology. But that's hopefully people would also be able to say, well, actually, let's mark this action somehow as really bad or really dangerous or something that's immoral or wrong or unethical, and let's actually do something to make sure it doesn't happen. Let's make sure we notify the authorities. Let's make sure this person is in safety or whatever. And I think on some level that just as people had this fear of Wikipedia being this sort of repository of vandalism and bad action that years later was shown to be totally not a real issue. It was like a non-issue with Wikipedia. I think that we will find the same thing happen, that most people are actually fairly good-willed and want the best for other people.
Thank you, sir. So the question, basically, the solution which you are proposing is some sort of a contract signed among X number of individuals to act together.
Say again, it's sort of a what?
It's a contract, basically.
Yeah.
It's an agreement
Yeah.
signed by X number of many
Yeah.
individuals to act together. Question, who will enforce?
Okay, that's a good question. So sometimes people will just have to live up to their word and you'll have to trust them. So for example, if you said, okay, let's all go to the demonstration and suddenly there's rain that day, that may actually be a reason why a lot of people don't go. And there may be ways of, quote unquote, enforcing it. There may be ways of ensuring that people actually live up to their actions. A lot of that will depend on the actual action. A hunger strike to the death there may not be people who actually live up to that just simply because the government's going to force feed them or something, who knows what. There's a million different things that can happen. It depends on the type of action. But in the case of the rally, you may simply have to say, okay, if I want to have at least there be 20,000 people to be safe, some people may actually want to up that and say, well, actually, I'll feel much safer if there's 40,000. And someone else will say, well, no, I'd go even if there was 5. I don't think there's enough cops to beat us all up if there's 5,000 people. So there may be ways in which you could just accept that not always the compliance will be met. It's much easier to say not do something, like not pay taxes, and it's much harder to actually do something that requires a huge amount of effort. So you're going to have to build this into the campaigns, and you're going to have to look at each action. Well, what does the action entail, and how much difficulty is there involved? How much risk is there involved? And then recognize that there will be failure. But I think this is also something I really want to find out from Free Staters is how many of the 20,000 people who said they'd move are actually going to do it. And what I see is that there's a bit of social pressure to actually live up to your word. And it'll be really interesting. So I want to have this conversation with you guys. How is this going? And what mechanisms do you have to enforce the assurance contract that you've made? Any other questions?
So I'm glad you're creating a new platform for this. All I could just complain, but I'm hearing some slightly anti-market, anti-capitalist stuff from you.
No, not slightly. Very, very, very anti-capitalist.
So I think it's interesting that you're actually using the principles of capitalism. You're creating an alternative. You're creating another market. You're creating an alternative in the marketplace to say, no, I don't like this, so I'm going to create.
Talking about Fairmundo.
Any of this stuff. You're seeing a problem. You're seeing a problem in the global marketplace, whether it's too much advertising or proprietary hardware, and you're saying, no, I want an alternative, and you're providing a platform to promote this alternative. which...
Those are just the examples that occurred to me. I mean,
But
I
you're
hope that you
creating-
guys can come up with more examples
Well, I'm just
that,
saying-
that actually fit into, you know, your ideology if it's different from mine. I don't actually want, you know, I'm not trying to get up here and tell you, you know, my ideology, and if it's different from what everybody else is, that's great. What I hope that people can take away from this is a tool for strategizing, and it is a tool to reach any needs, regardless of whether they're pro-capitalist or anti-capitalist.
Well, that's my point, is you're leveraging the technology revolution to create all these alternatives for people who want to find a better way. And so I'm just curious, how, do you think this is, he actually asked the question I was gonna ask, so, what do you see coming from the future of this? As this, I mean, is this gonna, do you think there's gonna be more of these, you know, collective actions or alternative, you know, micro-societies or alternative ways of doing business? Do you think that's gonna just expand, or do you think this just isn't going to work because it's just too hard for people?
So basically, what I think is that, you know, when Wikipedia started, you know, capitalists everywhere went, huh, you know, they looked at it and went, huh, that's crowdsourcing, okay, we can do that. And basically in every other sector of the internet, they said, okay, let's take what people are doing to help other people and use it to help me. You know, and they basically you know, just lodged on like a bunch of parasites onto every crowdsourced thing that was out there, and that's where we got the sharing, the so-called sharing economy, which is really just the fleecing economy, just a shearing economy. And so you know, the hope is that we can come up with alternatives to this, yes. And you know, and I hope that we can also inspire people to think about, well, actually, if we as the users of the internet were the owners of the internet, if it was a cooperative, then maybe we would actually have better luck than if a bunch of shareholders are deciding what sort of proprietary algorithms to push us around with, and they're basically like really threatening democracy as we know it, because they can basically, you know, control all your access to information. I don't know if I answered your question very well, but anyway, I'm here for the rest of the weekend. I'd really love to talk to all of you. If you have more questions, please let me know.
Thanks, Brian.